automatically, so call now for your...
Margaret?
What are woods?
Further off to the west, staying is all snowfall during this event, and unfortunately you see that shade of pink. That would indicate some freezing rain. Well, that's going to be a factor too. 3 o'clock, just about all of us seeing snow, at least in South Dakota. Still some ice and rain threats occurring off to our east, but then we'll be looking at snowfall kind of persisting throughout the region as we head into Saturday night, finally kind of wrapping up very early Sunday morning. So this storm system does end fairly quickly and doesn't look to stick around during the day on Sunday. Let's break down this detail too. By the way, there is a risk for severe weather over parts of northwestern Iowa, and kind of looking off to the southeast, you can see the bigger risk is over much of the state of Iowa. That's a 2 out of 5 on the scale. That's a slight risk for severe weather or tornadoes, hail, all of the above possible. The ice threat tomorrow certainly does exist, and we're going to be looking at some minor ice accumulations for parts of the area, a little bit worse in parts of Minnesota. And that snowfall forecast looking pretty impressive from around Watertown and Brookings through Huron and Mitchell. Not so much in Sioux Falls and southeast, nor around Aberdeen and northwest. The next 10 days in Sioux Falls taking us from the 40s tomorrow down to the 30s on Sunday. And then our next chance of snow will be arriving next Thursday. And again, we're going to be staying well below normal for temperatures over the 10-day forecast. In Aberdeen, again, winter storm.
Teddy and Mom are...
This economy. So this president is focused on that kind of economic investments, which are premised on increasing our economic capacity, which is the kind of sustainable economic growth that we're looking to see.
Given the good news that you just mentioned and the trend lines, which have been very, very positive, why do you think this president is not getting credit from voters for steering the economy in the right direction?
Well, I think that's a really complicated question. We know that the American Rescue Plan was really an insurance policy for this economy. What we know is that there are millions more families. We created, the economy created 7.4 million jobs over the past year during this presidency. And so we know millions of families are able to, have a job and put food on the table and pay their bills. What we know in the confidence data, a lot of that is premised on inflation. And we do have inflation. The president has acknowledged that. We understand that. He is focused on that. But what people also report is that their own finances are fairly healthy, but they see the kind of uncertainty in the economy that is there. So we're a pandemic-scarred society. That's not just the economy. There's uncertainty as we navigate our way out of this pandemic, and then the tensions, between Russia and Ukraine are going to add to that uncertainty as well.
As you describe the strength in the economy, if there were a policy decision made to stop importing Russian oil, what impact would that have, and do you see a resilience in the American economy to withstand that?
So again, we're in a very good position. What we know is that from the U.S. economy, we don't import a lot of Russian oil, but we are looking at options that we can take right now if we were to cut the U.S. consumption of Russian energy. But what's really most important is that we maintain a steady supply of global energy.
Last one, Josh.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, we're reporting right now that you are considering a ban on U.S. imports of Russian crude. Should I interpret your answer just now that it might be more targeted than that?
So we are considering a range of options, but what's really essential is that we maintain a steady supply of global energy. We don't want to disrupt. Look, energy is a global market, and we do not want to disrupt that market.
In today's report, the jobs number was great. The wage growth is pretty sluggish. I'm wondering, is that normal to expect a disconnect there? Does one typically follow the other? And what do you draw from that? How can you get wages to keep pace with the actual job numbers themselves?
So from month to month, data can be volatile. And so that's why we don't focus on month-to-month changes, especially in wages. But we did see robust growth even for lower wage industries, and we know that over the year wages are up. But the president's economic plan is really about having increases in wages that are sustained by increases in productivity, and they're really premised on the increase in the economic capacity, and that help families by lowering costs on those, in those areas, healthcare, prescription care, child care, that we know have been really squeezing pocketbooks over several decades.
Thank you, Dr. Ross, for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome anytime.
Okay, I just have 2 items for all of you at the top.
I just wanted to provide, I know we announced this yesterday or the day before, but a brief overview on two critical urgent funding needs the administration has sent to Congress. First, to provide assistance to Ukraine. The United States has already provided over $1.4 billion in assistance to Ukraine since 2021, and together with our European allies and partners, we are holding Russia accountable for its unjustified and unprovoked invasion. To continue this important work, we're requesting $10 billion to deliver additional security assistance for Ukraine, to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance for the Ukrainian people, and more support for stronger sanctions enforcement and for U.S. troop deployments to reinforce NATO's eastern flank and deter Russian aggression. This is an urgent priority. I think everybody would agree. Democrats, Republicans, the American people, and it is urgent so that we can continue to deliver on our commitment to support the Ukrainian people. Second, the other part of our request is on COVID-19 response. While we now have tools like vaccines, treatments, tests, and high-quality masks to protect people, we didn't get here by accident. It's a result of wise investments over the past 14 months that led to this widespread availability. And I would note that we did that while we had the rise of two variants that weren't even planned for, of course. Well, they were planned for, but we had to account for them, I should say, in our spending. We need additional funding from Congress to secure more medical supplies to keep this country moving forward. And let me be very clear, this is an urgent request, and this is what is at stake in our fight against COVID. By May, our current supply of monoclonal antibodies will stock out. By July, the current supply of pre-exposure prophylaxis drugs used to protect immunocompromised people will stock out. Funds are needed in March to secure additional supply in July. You have to order them ahead so that you have them when they're needed when you run out of stock. By September, we anticipate our supply of oral antivirals will run out if additional pills are not purchased now. And within weeks, we expect testing capacity to drop if additional investments are not made soon. And as I would note in the President's State of the Union, he also announced the American people can order more tests. So there, we obviously want to meet that demand. Given how costly COVID has been, with so many of our fellow Americans hospitalized or dying and our daily lives disrupted, we simply cannot afford to wait on investing now and keeping people protected.
Slow walking the toughest sanctions on Russia for its invasion in Ukraine in order to preserve the Iran nuclear agreement. Correspondent Jillian Turner takes a look at that tonight.
Just 900 miles from Kyiv, intense nuclear negotiations are underway in Vienna between the U.S., Russia, Iran, and a handful of nations set to ink a deal any moment.
Our assessment is that we are in the midst of the very final stages.
We are very, very close to the finish line.
But critics of the Biden administration claim it's making concessions to Russia at the expense of Ukraine.
They deliberately slow-walked actions on Ukraine, particularly the Nord Stream 2 pipeline sanctions, because they wanted to preserve what they understood to be cooperation with the Russian delegation on the Iranian nuclear deal in Vienna.
Here at home, the Biden team is sanctioning Vladimir Putin, but in Vienna, U.S. officials are on the same side as the Kremlin.
I would say diplomacy around the world requires us to engage with countries even where we have strong disagreements, strong opposition, strong condemnation.
Though a deal appears imminent, several major sticking points remain, including protections for America's key ally in the Mideast.
Win a nuclear conflict, Russia would be vaporized in the following 3 days. So again, I'm concerned that Putin is losing it. He's made a terrible strategic error. Every day is going to get worse for him. And the air cap would be a triggering event that I think President Biden would be loath to even think about seriously. Blinken put it to rest in NATO. They're doing the right thing.
You mentioned Secretary of State Blinken. Let's take a listen to a little more of how he's putting it.
We've never sought and will not seek conflict with Russia. At the same time, we'll keep open the door to dialogue and diplomacy while making clear to the Kremlin that unless it changes course, it will continue down the road of increasing isolation and economic pain.
If that middle ground is right as policy, then how does this end?
Well, I don't think we know. I think it's a grim ending for Ukraine. At some point, I can't imagine Putin knowing how to back out of this. What kind of fig leaf do we get him that he can claim victory? I think he's lost control, operational control of his ground forces in combat in Ukraine. So at some point, I think he overwhelms Ukrainian defense, and then he's got an impoverished country in passive and active rebellion. Millions of his Ukrainian citizens are all over Western Europe, and his economy slowly will take him down the tubes. He's got some rough days ahead. Perhaps the domestic opposition in Russia will change his mind. Perhaps the casualties the Russian military is going to sustain if they try and fight through Kyiv and Kharkiv street by street. But right now, Putin's stuck on a political calculus. It's a disaster, not just to Ukraine, but to the Russian country themselves.
Understood. General McCaffrey, thank you as always for your sober analysis.
Good to be with you, Aaron.
Absolutely. Heavy stuff. We got our shortest break of 60 seconds. When we come back, we turn, just as the president did, from all of these serious challenges abroad to the domestic front. James Carville on the policy and the politics in that address. We're back in a minute.
This is reporting from Poland on this crisis near the border with Ukraine. Now let's go to Arwa first. Arwa, you spoke with parents of sick Ukrainian children who were evacuated by train. What did they have to endure to simply get out of the country?
You know, Wolf, I cannot believe that they were actually able to get through this, because these parents, these mothers who we met, their children weren't just sick. These were children who were in hospice, and not just in any part of Ukraine, in Kharkiv, one of the hardest hit areas in all of Ukraine. These mothers were telling us about how, and we've all seen now the images of how crowded these trains were and what a jostle it was just to get on them. And through all of that, these mothers would cradle their children, carry them in their arms as they tried to push their way through. And many of them were saying that up until the moment they were able to get on that train that evacuated them from Ukraine back to Poland, they had not been able to put their child down. And you really just see the love of these parents for their children, this love that has effectively turned them into superheroes. And one of the more heartbreaking aspects of all of this, Wolf, was the realization, though, that even though they managed to get their children to safety, even though they managed to have their children survive this journey, because keep in mind, for a lot of these kids, doing this journey under normal times could severely threaten their lives, never mind trying to do it during a war zone. But what you really realize is the impact of everything that is happening for these parents back home. And one of these mothers who we met, Ira, had a horrible, horrible thing happen to her. Take a listen.
Папа ребенка, моя мама, сестра, все, папа мой. Никто не берет трубки, лодки идут. И все. А больше говорит, что каждый понимает, что это значит.
Employees to work at gunpoint. The Russian military bears down on Ukraine, fighting for the country's nuclear facilities. As the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations says, the world has narrowly averted catastrophe. Tonight, the attacks on civilians, the heartbreaking scene of a father mourning his 16-year-old son. And the chaos at the Kyiv train station, families torn apart as women and children flee for safety. Plus this scary video of Russian troops ambushing journalists. Russia blocks Facebook and Twitter. The crackdown tonight inside Russia. These anchors walking off set, saying no to war, as anyone who speaks out against the war faces 15 years in prison. Assassinating Putin? The United States senator who says the only way to end this war is for Russians to kill their president. The blowback tonight. Pain at the pump. The war hits American pocketbooks with the fastest rise in gas prices since 2005, as the cost per gallon goes up 11 cents overnight. Back-to-back snowstorms. We're tracking the winter weather threat, and a cabin-sized boulder blocks a highway near Lake Tahoe. And we go on the road with a grandfather's wish, granted by a caring group of students.
This is the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell, reporting from the nation's capital.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this Friday night. Tonight, it feels like the world is holding its breath after Russian troops seized the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe and now are closing in on another. The middle-of-the-night attack on the facility sparked fears of a disaster that Ukrainian officials warned would be 10 times larger than Chernobyl. The good news tonight, there are no reports of spikes in radiation. We are also learning tonight from the Pentagon that the Russians have fired more than 500 missiles so far. Look at this video of the devastation of entire blocks of some of the country's major cities as they lay in ruins, with the head of NATO warning the worst is yet to come. And the attacks are getting even more brutal. There are reports of Russian soldiers raping women, and NATO says the Russians are using cluster bombs, which are against international law. We have team coverage tonight, starting with CBS's Charlie DAKOTA in Kyiv. Good evening, Charlie.
Good evening, Nora. In a late-night address moments ago, President Zelenskyy, frustrated at NATO's refusal to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, had harsh words to say, quote, "All the people who will die starting from this day will die because of you." Nothing is off-limits to Russia's military machine, even nuclear power plants. U.S. officials say the world only narrowly avoided a nuclear catastrophe during the violent siege of Europe's biggest nuclear facility. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy called the attack terror on an unprecedented level. Russian tanks knew what they were firing at, he said, directly aiming at the station. After a slow start, the Russian invasion is now bearing down with fighting that is raging across the country, destroying cities, neighborhoods, and lives in its path. To the north, in Chernihiv, residential areas leveled after days of Russian shelling. This is a nightmare. How is this possible? A woman cries. Just look at this. South, to the besieged port city of Mariupol, where paramedics scramble to save the lives of civilians caught up in days of heavy fighting. A father weeps over the body of his 16-year-old son. Today, the NATO Secretary General accused the Russian military of using banned weapons.
We have seen the use of cluster bombs, which will be in violation of international law.
Increasing numbers of wounded Ukrainian soldiers have begun to arrive in Kyiv's hospitals as frontline fighting closes in on the capital itself. And a dramatic example of the violence and unpredictability here. Our colleagues at Sky News were ambushed on the outskirts of the city. Dozens of bullets tearing through the car. Attacked by a suspected Russian reconnaissance team. As fears of an all-out invasion climb, residents by the tens of thousands have swarmed the capital's train station, desperate to get away while they can. Families are torn apart, most of the men staying behind to fight. Parents try to console frightened children. Couples share one last goodbye. A father clutches a toy his 8-year-old son left behind, not knowing when they'll be together again. There has been a dramatic increase in tensions across the country and the city in the past 24 hours. Now, in terms of that Sky News team, we're happy to report that they're all okay. I got in touch with Stuart Ramsey. He's the correspondent. He's a good friend of mine right after I heard. He said there must have been 100 bullets that went through that van. He did get hit. He was treated in the hospital. He and his colleagues are all safe, and they're back in the UK. Nora?
War is such madness. Charlie DAKOTA, thank you. Well, here at home, the White House announced that Vice President Kamala Harris will travel to Poland and Romania next week, while U.S. senators tomorrow will meet with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy via Zoom. CBS's Nancy Cordes has new details from the White House.
Mr. Putin must stop this madness.
A dire warning today from the U.S. ambassador to the UN. Another nuclear facility could now be at risk.
Russian forces are now 20 miles and closing from Ukraine's second largest nuclear facility. So this imminent danger continues.
U.S. officials said today they're working to determine whether Russia's attacks on civilian targets, from power plants to schools to apartment buildings, meet the legal definition of war crimes.
Stability in Europe hangs in the balance.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken held emergency meetings at NATO headquarters in Belgium, his first stop in a six-nation European blitz aimed at keeping allies in lockstep.
Unfortunately, tragically, horrifically, this may not be over soon. And so these efforts that we're making together, we have to sustain them.
Here in Washington, President Biden met with the president of Finland, a country that shares an 800-mile-long border with Russia.
President Obama used to say, we'd be all right if we left everything to the Nordic countries. We'd be fine. We usually don't start wars.
As this war rages on, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham caused a stir by suggesting Vladimir Putin should be assassinated.
The only way this ends, my friend, is for somebody in Russia to take this guy out.
Does the White House have any take on that statement? Is it helpful at this point?
That is not the position of the United States government, and certainly not a statement you'd hear come from the mouth of anybody working in this administration.
And it wasn't just the administration. Lawmakers on the left and the right quickly disavowed any talk of assassination. The fear is, Nora, that if Vladimir Putin feels personally threatened, he might be tempted to lash out militarily, even more than he already has.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. Thanks. Well, a new Iron Curtain has fallen in Russia, and this time it's an information Iron Curtain. That's why most Russians don't know what's really happening in Ukraine. The Kremlin today blocked Facebook and Twitter, and there are no independent media outlets left. CBS's Roxana Saberi reports from London.
No to war was the final message broadcast by TV Rain, one of Russia's last independent media outlets. The staff then walk out, leaving behind a parting shot, the ballet Swan Lake, a nod to what Soviet Russia played in times of turmoil. A similar scene played out at Russia's oldest liberal radio station, Echo of Moscow, which says it's been forced to close.
We just can say welcome to the USSR.
These acts of defiance come as Russia's parliament passed a law effectively criminalizing the spread of information opposing the Kremlin's narrative on the war against Ukraine. Simply calling it a war or an invasion instead of a special military operation can lead to up to 15 years behind bars. The Kremlin is trying to control discontent over the war. At least 8,000 protesters have been arrested, and Russians are reeling from crushing Western sanctions. In Moscow, residents rushed to a local IKEA store just before the furniture giant joined other Western brands pulling out of the country. This shopper says, "This is the first time I've seen anything like this. It feels like we're lined up to buy salt or bread in wartime." And tonight, many Russian journalists are fearing for their safety. Some have already fled the country this week. With today's legislation, others are now packing up and getting ready to go. Nora?
Roxana Saberi in London. Well, there are worries about the war in Ukraine that sent stocks on a tailspin today, despite a blockbuster jobs report. All three of the major indexes, the Dow, NASDAQ, and S&P, all closed down. And gas prices are taking a bigger bite out of our wallets, rising at a rate not seen since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Here's CBS's Carter Evans.
Americans are heading back to work. The economy added 678,000 jobs in February, much more than expected, taking the unemployment rate down to 3.8%, a pandemic low.
We've seen this uptick in hiring with the expectation that the economy is really going to be booming as we get out of this Omicron wave, as we get into springtime.
The job market is so hot right now, there are nearly 2 openings for every applicant, and that demand drove wages up. Average earnings in the U.S. are now more than $31 an hour, but the raises leveled off last month.
What does that mean when it comes to demand for workers?
More people are coming back into the labor force. A lot of people who retired early are unretiring.
Still, the wage increases are not keeping up with inflation, which is forecast to be at 8% soon. It's especially painful at the gas pump. The national average is now almost $3.84 a gallon, up 11 cents since yesterday and 26 cents from last week. In California, where cars line up for the cheapest gas, average prices are now more than $5 a gallon for the first time ever.
It's what, $5.29 today? Ridiculous. You got to remember, I'm 77 years old. I used to have a Volkswagen. I paid 32 cents a gallon for fuel. This is ridiculous.
When can we see gas prices actually start to decline?
Realistically, it's going to be a...
He tells me they're planning to go to Vienna.
Can you believe that you're being forced to choose another country to go to?
Для меня сейчас.
I want to be away from the danger, she says, so I can have my children live in peace. A son hugs his mother after what he's heard.
The tears of a mother, yeah.
Their father staying back too to fight the Russians.
Do you worry about your husband?
Конечно.
Yes, she says, but he told us to go.
You thinking about your father?
Very much, he tells me. I'm having a hard time. I love him. Watching it all, his younger sister, Zlata.
Please be safe. Please be safe.
And with so much need here, that young volunteer who came from Germany helping these families, revealing to me one of the things they need most right now.
The problem is that we can't find drivers to drive to the countries. That's the only problem we have. So we really need drivers.
To get them there.
Yeah.
These buses picking up many of the refugees who walked here, crossing the border. Through the window, we see the families who came on foot, pushing strollers, the children walking.
The long exodus for so many of these Ukrainian families who say their journey has been days long.
Mothers carrying their children, the boy carrying his dinosaur. They come by foot, by bus, and by train. And at the train station, the emotion on their faces when they make it, realizing all they've left behind and the unknown ahead. The little girl wearing hearts and holding her unicorn, her mother holding her.
We have seen so many images just like that one, children holding their favorite stuffed animal, the one stuffed animal they brought with them, and of course the mothers holding their children. I know many of you at home have reached out to me on social media asking how you can help in this humanitarian effort. So we have put a link on our website. You can go to unicefusa.org/ABC. Well, tonight the White House says it is deeply concerned about the threat to freedom of speech inside Russia. There has been a new crackdown tonight. The Kremlin and Parliament now threatening reporters with up to 15 years in prison for spreading what they call, quote, fake news, potentially outlawing words like war or invasion. And tonight here, the last thing the independent TV station played before they walked out. Mary Bruce at the White House.
Tonight, the White House says it is deeply concerned about Russian plans to block access to Facebook and threats to freedom of speech as the Kremlin is now cracking down on the press. Vladimir Putin signing a law tonight making it a crime to spread what the Russian government considers fake news about the conflict in Ukraine. The maximum penalty, 15 years in jail. Independent Russian news outlets have always found it difficult to operate. Now it's impossible. The staff at Moscow's last independent TV station walking off set as their final symbolic broadcast played out. Swan Lake, the ballet that played on state TV at the fall of the Soviet Union. Some Western networks, including ABC News, are now not broadcasting from the country.
We don't want to find that out the hard way by finding that someone has said something which we believe to be true or used words which are now outlawed, like war or invasion, and find that we're then punished in a completely draconian and unacceptable way.
More than 8,000 anti-war protesters have been detained across Russia in the last week, according to an independent report. They too could face up to 15 years in jail. But Putin's support does run deep, as our James Longman saw.
So you don't believe that Russia is invading Ukraine at the moment?
Of course I do not believe it. It's nonsense, she says. If it was needed, Russia would have captured Ukraine a long time ago.
Mary Bruce joins us from the White House tonight. And Mary, we've now seen several news organizations pause their own broadcasting from Russia. And of course, we know that includes ABC News.
David, because of this new censorship law passed in Russia today, we are now seeing some Western networks, including CNN, Bloomberg, and the BBC, and of course our very own ABC News team, now not broadcasting from Russia. An ABC News spokesperson adding, quote, "We will continue to assess the situation and determine what this law means for the safety of our teams on the ground." The White House tonight telling me the Russian people deserve to know about the death and destruction being inflicted by their government on the people of Ukraine. David.
But yes, the safety and security of our team is paramount. Mary Bruce live at the White House. Mary, thank you. Meanwhile, as they crack down on any dissent in Russia, in Ukraine, families turn fighters, civilians, mothers and fathers, now practicing getting ready for the Russians, how they're going to fight them. And they showed our Matt Gutman the way. Matt reporting again from Lviv tonight.
Tonight, a tense moment at a checkpoint. Guns are pointed. It's a dry run by civilians preparing to fight and take on the Russians.
The men with the guns are actually former teachers, brewers, welders. They're now the new inductees into this militia, trying to fight back.
In an insurgency in its infancy, citizens now gather in bomb shelters to learn how to assemble and disassemble AK-47s and stash Molotov cocktails around town.
On your knees together. And 10.
Students learn how to carry the wounded. And a mother cinches tourniquets.
You're someone who was doing programming for mobile phone games, and now you're doing this. Is it surreal?
Yes, sometimes it's like I just want to drink enough coffee and waking up from this, but I don't.
And this nightmare is real. As missiles fall, rescuers carry the wounded, cries ringing out across Ukraine. We were invited into this sprawling checkpoint. Concrete bunkers, coils of concertina wire, ramparts of sandbags.
We built this.
With your wives, your parents, and children, you built all of this.
Yeah.
The sandbags, the drums.
Yeah, from the one day.
Oleg is one of the civilian commanders here.
They want to show us something right now. What is that? A mine?
Yeah.
These are mines.
Yeah.
So do they work still?
Yeah.
So this is to what, blow up Russian tanks?
Yes.
And David, those fighters, men and women, telling us they can't fend off the Russians with just Molotov cocktails and old Soviet mines. They need weapons and they need training. David.
Matt Gutman live in Lviv tonight. Matt, thank you very much. In just a short time from now, a special live edition of 2020, 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central, will be here on the Poland-Ukraine border with our team of correspondents across the region and in Ukraine, and of course back in Washington as well.
I love you all. It sounded like he wasn't sure he was going to make it out. What was your reaction when you got that text?
Sick. And I didn't want to give up hope, but I'm still human. And I just said, I may not get my child back. I may not see him again. I was literally devastated, dropped to the floor. My mental was completely done. My physical was giving out on me. The only thing that held me together was my spiritual glue. And I had to hold it together because he needed us. He needed the strength of his mom and the power from his father. And he held on. I mean, he is traveled all over the place. I told him so many times, I just respect you so much. You can just pick up and just go. His passport is just pages filled. I'm like, Maurice, do you have any more pages left for them to send? And he just is all over the place, and I respect him so much for that. But it's like, man, this is so scary. Like, he was literally in the middle of a war, and we're just regular people. And our son is in the middle of a war. We were devastated.
Mike, what was it like for you when you finally saw him and you knew he was back home safe?
Oh, I was elated. I'm glad to see him. Saw the little chicken legs coming through the door.
Maurice, what was it like for you to hit U.S. soil again after what you'd been through? How long did it take you to get across the border? Wasn't it something like 9 hours?
Yeah, it took me 9 hours to get across the border, and it took me some hours after that to get on U.S. soil. It took me some days after that to come on U.S. soil, so I'm just happy to be back here now. When I seen the plane about to land, and I knew where it was landing at, you know, I shedded a tear on the plane. It was crazy. And I was the first seat on the plane. I was the first one to get off the plane.
Yeah.
So I was very happy, you know, just to be back home, be with my family, and you know, say have my friends.
Right. Mo, do you feel an allegiance to Ukraine and feel a need to support them, considering what's happening there now, and you've lived there and worked there?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I love Ukraine. Ukraine is like a second home. I mean, I've been there the majority of my years playing overseas, and it's a beautiful place. It's got beautiful people. You know, you don't have to really worry about no nonsense when you're going over there. It's so sad that, you know, they really at war right now, and the men of Ukraine can't leave and go with their families and nothing. They have to sit there and fight while, you know, their wives, sisters, children, whatever, are leaving their site. It's ridiculous to me.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Well, you lived it, and we're glad to have you back here in the States. Mo Creek and Pammy and Mike Morgan, it's great to have all of you. Best of luck to your whole family, and thanks for the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As the war enters its second weekend, we have heard some amazing stories from the people of Ukraine. Up next, more of the voices from a nation.
In the next few weeks, Iran's ongoing nuclear advances will make it impossible to return the JCPOA.
We are at the very end. We practically finished. I cannot imagine that at this stage the talks may collapse. It would be absolutely irresponsible, especially at this stage when we are actually on the finish line.
Those are Russians at the table, crucial, according to the Biden administration, for the Iran nuclear deal. That's the JCPOA. You heard the Secretary of State. Here's how the Washington Examiner writes: the JCPOA 2.0 Ukraine crisis offers Biden cover for that. The State Department did issue a ban on U.S.-Russian diplomatic engagement, but it exempted the nuclear talks from it, thereby undercutting the administration's tough talk about putting Russia in the global penalty box. NBC News says about this deal, under one draft interim agreement, Tehran would be required to stop enriching uranium up to 60% purity and dispose of its current stockpile, possibly by exporting it to Russia, along with other restrictions. In exchange, the Iranian government would receive access to billions of dollars in oil revenues frozen in foreign bank accounts, and the U.S. would receive a lot of oil. We're back with the panel. Jason, it does seem to fit in why maybe some of this is looking for oil to fill a vacuum.
Yeah, Brett, this is complicating things. Biden's domestic policy agenda with respect to fossil fuels is certainly complicating things, and he needs to realize we're in a different situation now. This is a big deal what's happening with Ukraine and Russia. We need to reassure our European allies that if they're not getting their energy supply from Russia, they'll be able to count on the U.S. And that means ending the war here in the U.S. on fossil fuels, threatening to tax gas and oil companies through the roof to satisfy the progressive agenda. This is just the new reality that we're living under, and I really expected to see more of a pivot from Biden in the State of the Union address on this front, the way we saw, for instance, in Germany, but that's not what we've been seeing so far, and I think they need a reality check here.
Remember, the Biden administration is made up of
$730.
That's something.
Get a whole lot of something.
Selling a home is
I think it was
sunset there this evening, and again, skies will become cloudy overnight. A few showers are possible overnight as well. The better chance, though, towards.
Maybe it's time to try
having to go to NATO. As you suggested, Pakistan, for example, is a major non-NATO ally. Is that
something that we are considering in Finland's case?
I think we're going to let the meeting take place, and then we will have more to say after the meeting concludes.
Okay. On your answer before on Iran, has the president reviewed the current draft agreement? I understand there are some issues, including some with the IAEA, that are going to get addressed tomorrow when the chief of the IAEA is in Tehran. But has he reviewed and approved the agreement as it now stands?
He has been regularly briefed on the status of the negotiations, but I'm not going to get into more specifics beyond that.
His belief that any of this has to go to Congress, you've gotten that letter from 30-odd members of Congress?
We are aware of the letter. I don't have anything to convey on that either. Let's see where this lands. Obviously, there's more work to be done, pivotal pieces at the very end, so I don't have anything to convey officially on that at this point.
And the very last is just a follow-up on Phil's question. So on the question of why it is that we have not seen more cyber activity by the Russians at this point, do you believe that it has to do more with the defenses, as you described, in other words, passive deterrence that wouldn't be able to affect us, or do you think it has to do with something that was happening inside Russia, decisions that they made about when to go use these weapons?
It's not a place I can get into from here, David. I would say, though, we continue to be prepared. We continue to be prepared for retaliatory action, whether it is cyber or other means, and it's something we've been preparing for several months. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. A couple of questions. President Zelenskyy said yesterday that if the West is unwilling to put in place a no-fly zone, it should at least provide Ukraine with warplanes so it can defend itself. Is that something that the U.S. is considering?
We have provided a range of security and military assistance, including defensive assistance. We've recently provided helicopters that I think my defense colleagues confirmed earlier today or yesterday, but I don't have anything in addition to predict on that front.
And on a different topic, Ron Klain was on a podcast yesterday, and he suggested that the president was considering further extending the student loan moratorium, which expires in May. What can you tell us about that? When can we expect a decision, and is he looking at another 90-day extension?
Certainly understand your question. That is obviously something we will continue to assess and review as we get closer to May. Typically, there's a period of time where you need to make a decision, or you at least need to convey to the lenders what they should prepare for, but I don't have anything to predict at this point in time. Go ahead, Karen.
Thanks, Jen. Overnight hours might even see a little bit of drizzle.
Now.
I've had quite a journey
for now across the area with overcast conditions. That's going to be changing heading into Saturday. Here's what the rest.
Every single day we have people who bring their best. We have people who travel through blizzards and storms to show people.
Only a few convictions have ever been won in the International Criminal Court. As for apprehending Putin,
it's very difficult to imagine a scenario in which Putin will actually be in the dock as a head of state, as somebody that nobody's going to be able to go into Russia and apprehend him.
But an indictment for war crimes, experts say, could weaken Putin in other ways.
No more summits, no more going, no more hope of visiting his tens of billions of dollars of property. And I think in the end, he'll make him quite dispensable as a leader of Russians.
The Kremlin has categorized.
Tonight, the war in Ukraine. Russian forces seizing the largest nuclear plant in Europe. The Russian military now occupying that nuclear facility where a fire erupted overnight as it came under attack. New images of the destruction as Russians advance on major cities. NATO accusing Russia of using cluster bombs banned by international law. The chaos at the train station in Kiev, thousands racing to get out. More than 1 million refugees have now fled. A staggering 500,000 of them children. We're inside a school where some 80 evacuated orphans have found refuge. And Vladimir Putin's crackdown on the media in Russia as Facebook and Twitter are banned. Our team inside Moscow. Also tonight, the reversal by the Supreme Court after the Boston Marathon bomber's death sentence was thrown out. More of my NBC NBC News exclusive with former Attorney General William Barr. What he's now saying about then-President Trump's photo op with a Bible in front of a church after police cleared out protesters by force. Barr on what made him feel embarrassed. And the Stanford soccer star who tragically took her own life. Her parents speaking out about their heartbreak. The email from the university they are raising questions about.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening, everyone. It seems no one and no thing is safe from the bare-knuckles Russian assault on Ukraine. What to many there is feeling more and more indiscriminate. The Russians applying a sheer brute force strategy that has destroyed residential areas and overnight even targeted Europe's largest nuclear plant, setting it on fire. Thankfully, no signs of radiation release, but Ukraine's president giving voice to the close call that shook us all. We experienced a night that could stop history, he said. In Kiev, the closing approach of Russian troops setting off a desperate panic. Families urgently trying to escape before it's too late, packing into train cars. The images like sorrowful pages from another time. And it's where we start tonight. Richard Engel from inside the chaos in the embattled city.
After President Vladimir Putin apparently misjudged Ukrainian resistance, he appears to be trying to make up for it with brute force, wiping out this neighborhood in Chernihiv. This is what's left of a school that officials in Zhytomyr say was hit by a Russian strike. And NATO now accuses Russia of using cluster bombs, indiscriminate weapons banned by many countries, though not Russia or the United States. Ukrainian civilians are paying a heavier price by the day as Russia's invasion grows more relentless and more reckless. With a chilling attack overnight on Europe's biggest nuclear plant. You can see Russian tracer fire in this black and white surveillance footage. Flames and flares pouring out of a building near the plant. Ukraine's President Zelenskyy calling it a night that could have stopped history. Speaking in Russian, warning radiation does not know where the borders of your country are. Tonight, Russia has seized control of the plant. UN officials say none of the reactors was hit and that no radiation was released. Meanwhile, Russian forces are having success in the south. After taking Kherson, now firing on Odessa and surrounding and attacking Mariupol, where the mayor says they're running out of food. Russia's apparent aim to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. In the capital, Kiev, there's now an urgent scramble to escape.
As Russian forces are getting closer to the city, people are streaming out of it. Parents are tethered to their children, they're taking their pets, they're taking their grandparents, and everyone is heading west. You're hearing the train announcements and the train whistles and these long lines of people climbing onto the tracks. It feels to me like another era.
The most crazy feel when you hear how kids screaming, mothers screaming. It's so crazy, that panic. You see how people so afraid.
It's been like this all day. There's a lot of confusion about where these trains are departing from. People had been waiting here on platform 9. There was just an announcement a few moments ago that the train to the west is actually leaving from platform 12. Now everyone is rushing there, and nobody wants to miss it. This is the push right up at the door. There's been some people dropping bags. We've seen people holding their babies up in the air as they're trying to cram as many people possible onto this train. A lot of families we spoke to said they decided this morning to pack up their house, come here to the station, and just head west.
Oksana is taking her 1-year-old. They're leaving her husband behind with no idea where they'll eventually end up. We're at war, she says. We have to get the children out. Oleksiy, staying behind to fight, told us saying goodbye to his wife and son is the hardest moment of his life.
President Zelenskyy, who has criticized the West for not doing more to help Ukraine, again today called for a no-fly zone, but NATO ruled it out, just as the United States has done. Lester?
Richard, those scenes just rip your heart out. Thank you for that. And you saw those images at the train station tonight. We're also following those making it to relative safety in western Ukraine and across the border, including an unprecedented number of children. Tom Yamas tonight on Ukraine's exodus.
Tonight in the bitter cold, with the snow falling, the Great Escape rolls on.
And when Ukrainians reach refugee camps like this one in Romania, the great shock settles in.
When I tell my mom that I will go to save my life, Mom was crying and told me that maybe she never see me again. It was most scary words which I heard in my life.
We're now learning an unprecedented 500,000 children have fled Ukraine in just the last week. In refugee camps across Eastern Europe, the adults try to create small moments of normalcy, handing out bubbles and celebrating birthdays.
I hope we will win soon, the war will end and we come home again.
Some have to stay in Ukraine for now. These children are living at a specialized school in Lviv in western Ukraine. There are 80 of them, orphans, who were evacuated from the east when their towns were bombed by the Russians. Who called you to tell you we have the orphans coming?
Teachers from those regions called me to take these children.
So Lviv did. The children are not only being fed, they're also being taught.
What's it like to know that these orphans had to be taken out of a war zone?
It's something like, it's very painful and hard, but we know that children are our future, and we try to think positive.
Children like 8-year-old Demetrius. What do you want the world to know about Ukraine? Demetrius tells me he wants the war to stop so that he can go back home. He's hoping to be adopted. Anything you want to say to anybody, any of your friends back in that other region? Demetrius's answer is soul-crushing.
I want them to stay alive, not to die.
As for the people of Lviv, the ones helping him, he says thank you.
It's hard to take, my friend. What do we know about how long Demetrius and the other children will be there and what happens next for them?
Well, Lester, they're going to be here as long as they can. They're being fed, as you saw there. They're being housed, taken care of, and they're still going to school. The staff there wants to make things as normal as possible, but I did ask what happens if the fighting comes west. They said if the children are ever at risk, they will evacuate them. Lester?
And is that has to be a concern right now, that this war that has spared that area so far could move in that direction?
Yeah, we have noticed an uptick in preparedness over the last few days. Major government buildings, the police stations now have barricades around them. They're wrapping historical statues in this special sort of plastic so the shelling doesn't affect them. And then even here at our hotel, they're starting to pull up metal barriers in front of the windows. Lester?
And the train is the only way out for these folks we've been seeing?
The train, or if you want to walk to the border, if you can get into a car. But yes, the train is still packed, still very full. And once you get to that border, you see tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people trying to get through.
All right, Tom, we appreciate your work. Thank you. For their part, Russia and President Vladimir Putin are taking harsh new steps tonight to control messaging about the war, including a press crackdown that has prompted some international news organizations to suspend operations there. Keir Simmons is in Moscow.
Tonight, President Putin, in another televised message with tensions between Russia and NATO on a knife edge. The Russian leader saying there are no bad intentions towards our neighbours and I would advise them not to escalate the situation. Government officials and business leaders appearing by video link. The Russian president now away from the Kremlin, speaking from his residence outside Moscow. Earlier, President Putin held an hour-long call with Germany's Chancellor. Germany saying it had urged Russia to end the fighting. But the fighting continues, and tonight, inside Russia, the president signing a new law passed by Parliament making it illegal to distribute so-called false information about the military operation. Calling the operation in Ukraine an invasion or a war could be illegal. Breaking the law could result in up to 15 years in prison. Meanwhile today, Facebook was officially blocked by Russia's internet regulator, and Twitter has been restricted, according to state media.
And tonight, more independent news organisations have been taken offline here, including the BBC's Russian service, a state-funded German channel, and Radio Free Europe. Lester?
Oh, very chilling. All right, Keir Simmons, thank you. Here at home, the Biden administration is under growing pressure tonight to cut Russian oil imports as the president gains new support from the leaders of countries near Russia. Kelly O'Donnell has more now for us from the White House.
A message to Moscow, outreach to Russia's neighbors. President Biden on the phone today with Poland's president and in the Oval Office with Finland's leader.
We usually don't start wars.
Finland long a neutral buffer between Russia and the West. Today coordinating with President Biden against Putin's unprovoked war.
We're committed to helping Ukraine defend itself.
The White House is under bipartisan pressure to turn up the pain on Putin by blocking Russian oil sales.
I'm all for that. Ban it.
Ban the oil.
Ban the oil come from Russia. Yep.
We need to stop buying Russian oil and gas. We need to produce more here at home.
Today, the administration said it's considering some form of Russian ban.
We are looking at options that we can take right now if we were to cut the U.S. consumption of Russian energy.
Imported Russian oil makes up only about 3 to 4% of what is used in the U.S. But Secretary of State Blinken cautioned that any ban could push already climbing gas prices even higher. AAA says nationwide a gallon jumped 11 cents overnight, the highest one-day increase since 2016.
There's no strategic interest in reducing the global supply of energy. The immediate effect would be to raise prices at the pump for Americans.
Officials also say a ban may not harm Russia if it can sell that oil elsewhere. Lester?
Kelly, thank you. Some welcome news for the president tonight on the economic front. Employers added 678,000 jobs last month. That's far higher than analysts had expected. The unemployment rate fell from 4% to 3.8%, though wage gains flattened and continue to be wiped out by inflation. Also today, the Supreme Court reinstated the death sentence for the Boston Marathon bomber, Jawhar Tsarnaev, reversing a federal.
See how this plays out. Is it going to be applied? Is anyone going to be prosecuted? We've heard some Russian politicians say that it could be used retroactively to go after people in the government's eyes that are mischaracterizing or misportraying what's going on in Ukraine. So it's a huge concern amongst journalists here.
And separate issue, Ryan, I know you follow the energy sector closely. We're learning the White House is taking a serious look at banning the importation of Russian oil. What would that mean for the United States and our economy?
Well, ultimately, it would mean that the oil price would rise and the price at the pump would likely rise. Look, the United States is a huge oil producer, the world's largest, produces a lot of oil now on the back of shale oil. Russia only provides about 8% in terms of all crude products of the imports into the U.S. behind Canada and Mexico. But the issue is that if the U.S. bans these imports, the expectation is, for example, the European Union could too. So you have less supply, higher prices. And the real concern, I think, for the Biden administration might be that that doesn't mean it would hurt the Russian economy necessarily, because the Russians might just be able to sell that oil that they're selling into the United States elsewhere. Judy?
Well, movement on so many fronts, and watching it all from Moscow. Ryan Chilcote, thank you very much. With Russian military forces on the offensive in Ukraine, countries in Europe are on edge. One nation that shares an 800-mile border with Russia is Finland, which has a stable and prosperous democracy. Finland is not a member of NATO, but it buys military equipment from the United States and is a member of the European Union. Finland's president, Sauli Niinisto, met with President Biden this afternoon, and I spoke with him a short time ago. President Niinisto, thank you very much for talking with us. You flew more than, 4,300 miles from Helsinki to Washington to talk to President Biden. What can you tell us came out of that meeting?
It was a very pleasant meeting with him, surely because of what is taking place in Ukraine, the Russian attack, security, defense. Those were the issues we discussed very much. And we have a long-lasting cooperation with the United States, Finland and Sweden, all Nordic countries, and that will be enhanced in the future. I'm very satisfied with our discussions.
When you say the relationship will be enhanced, how so?
We're talking about a kind of process where we take issue by issue, not defining them yet, at the table and see what all we can do together and support each other.
And does part of that include Finland seeking membership now in NATO?
That is surely a different issue. It's up to Finland. I understand that NATO keeps its doors open, like the principle has been for those who meet the criteria. And in Finland, we have a very, very lively and important discussion going on about NATO and NATO membership and about applying it. But like I said, discussion is ongoing, and our parliament is very active on that. And at the end, it's a decision made by the parliament.
Do you believe Finland is as safe outside of NATO as it would be inside NATO?
We have been totally safe, but surely things what we have now seen in Europe, we have to consider. I do not doubt that Russia would attack militarily to Finland, but Russia's demand to, like they say, keep out of NATO, or they want NATO to stop taking new members, it might lead to a situation where Russia expects that it has kind of a say around its neighborhood, and that is not at all pleasant thing.
Do you believe, after speaking today with President Biden, that there is any way to stop Vladimir Putin from overtaking Ukraine, this bloody invasion of Ukraine, whether it involves diplomacy or any other method?
Now it seems that Putin is going to continue. Is he successful or not? That is still open, but it is very, very difficult to get him backing. That is very obvious, at least not now.
You said it's not clear if he'll be successful. So are you saying you think there's a good chance the Ukrainians could prevail?
What we have seen so far is that Ukrainians have a very brave way of protecting, defending themselves, and Russians haven't gone forward in a speed they undoubtedly thought before that they could reach. So it's not going right in the way that Russians had planned.
You also said, President Niinistö, that if Russia succeeds, that it changes the security of the entire continent. That clearly Russia poses a different kind of threat. What does that mean?
What we see today is more united European Union and Europeans than ever. And that means that Europe will also develop its defense and take much more responsibility of its own security. I think that what German Chancellor Scholz said, that was a total change in German politics. They gave arms to Ukrainians and they decided to increase their budget, defense budget, with quite a lot of new money. And that is totally new position in Germany. And that means that Europe will be stronger.
Europe may be stronger, maybe more united, but if Russia prevails, it still means the rest of the continent is standing by helplessly while Russia essentially gobbles up another country.
Here have heard specifically NATO countries and NATO trying to avoid escalation so that we would see even more warfare in Europe, maybe even something which reminds of World War. So it's the danger of escalation, but it has a meaning if Europe is stronger in the future, because it prevents also, it is a clear kind of obstacle to the one who might try something, and to Russia.
But it's almost as if Ukraine is a sacrifice in this process.
European countries have helped, like United States too, very much Ukrainian, not only by money, but sending arms and more arms. So Ukraine is, from that aspect, not alone. It has been helped, at least.
One final question about Vladimir Putin himself. Do you believe he is acting in a rational way or not right now?
It might be that this irrationality, what we have seen, at the end is rational. Maybe he wants to things look like irrational, and that's the rationality. It's quite complex.
Yes, it certainly does appear to be. President Saul Niinistö, we thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
In the day's other news, U.S. job growth surged in February as the Omicron wave of COVID-19
river and move into western Ukraine. So far, the Russians have been bogged down here. After they came out of Kherson, they started moving west. They took an airfield. We'll go ahead and look at the airfield. It's right about here. A satellite image of the airfield that the Russians took, and then the Ukrainians took it back. Take a look at this video from Ukrainian forces pushing the Russians back. Okay, we'll come back here to the map. Why is that airfield so important? One, for resupply to move on Odessa here and cut off the Ukrainians' access to the Black Sea. The other is it allows them to move north and west and cut off Kyiv, the capital city there. Robert Sherman, our reporter, is just about here in Ukraine, a city right now that is under a curfew, and joins us from there. Good evening, Robert.
Good evening to you, Leland. As you said, night has fallen here, so martial law and curfew are in effect. As you can see behind us, you don't want to be going outside, because if you're caught on the streets, the expectation and suspicion is that you are a Russian saboteur. But we have been speaking with Ukrainians for days, and we keep asking them the exact same question. What do you want from NATO, the West, and the United States? They always give us the same answer. Listen to this.
We want the sky over Ukraine to be closed by NATO forces.
We ask to close the sky above Ukraine.
We really need the closing airspace.
But as we know, Leland, that is not going to happen. NATO making it clear that they will not be getting involved in closing the airspace. That being said, most Ukrainians we speak with still remain optimistic. They've never seen their military in action before. They've been impressed with what they've seen. They've been impressed with the way that their military has hung on for this long. In terms of where we are here in western Ukraine, we're seeing the supply chains remaining rock solid. People still have power here and things of that nature. We're actually seeing a lot of people volunteering and helping send supplies, food, water to those in Kyiv and Kharkiv out east. One other thing to mention, though, Leland, for those who are trying to leave the country, sometimes you have to walk 20 to 30 miles. It is very cold here, less than 30 degrees and dropping. Leland?
Yeah. Eastern Europe in the winter is a very difficult place, and that is what the Russians are finding out. Robert, thank you very much. Speaking of the supply chains and the logistical issues, that's where the Russians are really bogged down. They're trying to attack Kyiv here from the northeast and then also for the northwest. And they have been bogged down now for days because of their logistical issues. They can't move supplies. They can't move fuel to their troops. They are running out of ammunition and gas, hence why they are firing into these neighborhoods here and here, trying to effectively make sure that there is no Ukrainians behind them if they are able to move on the capital of Kyiv. There's a little bit of a cognitive disconnect here because we keep hearing from the United States and from the Pentagon that these convoys are bogged down and the Russians are having a difficult time. At the same time, we hear from NATO commanders and the Secretary General of NATO that it's likely this weekend is going to see even worse fighting and even more civilian casualties at the hands of the Russians. How to square that circle? Kelly Meyer spent the day at the Pentagon to find out. Joins us now. Kelly, good evening.
Good evening, Leland. Well, we're already seeing it with Russian rocket fire and heavy bombing, cutting off electricity, water, and heat. As Robert mentioned, it's 28 degrees in Kyiv now. And we know Russia has now 92% of its combat power in Ukraine, and they're devastating the south. We're told Putin is learning from his missteps in those first 9 days of this war. He is recalculating, and we're already seeing that play out with his reckless nuclear power plant attack. Senior defense officials say when it is your goal to control population centers and replace the government of a country, it isn't a surprise they would want to control the infrastructure. A nuclear power plant makes that list, and senior defense officials say it appears Putin now has control of that power plant. Leland?
It certainly has control, and now he can do what he wants. The power plant's down here. There's a few other nuclear power plants here. So far, none of those have been struck from the air. We've talked about the ground war. This is where the red is that the Russians have been able to push through. We don't know how much of the countryside they control. Then there is the air war. And the Russians have been able to hit a number of key Ukrainian military sites. They did most of those on the first day, but as we've been talking to Robert, who's in and around here, he hears air raid sirens a lot there. The flip side is the Ukrainian Air Force is also still flying. They shot down a Russian plane today. How, after so long, Kelly, has the Ukrainian Air Force taken on the far, far larger Russian Air Force?
Well, senior defense officials say Ukrainians still have a significant majority of their air power, helicopters, fighter jets, Stinger missiles, and drones. Senior defense officials do tell us the Ukrainians have had some setbacks, but they're putting up a strong fight in the air. And right now, not one side has full control of the skies. They remain contested here. Leland?
Yeah, with the Ukrainians still getting a lot of Stinger missiles being brought in from Poland, Slovakia, through the supply lines we've talked a lot about towards Kyiv, and then all the way further on to Kharkiv. It's made it very hard for the Russians to fly their helicopters. Kelly, thank you very much. The Russian Air Force is still flying.
His word. His nuclear engagement, what exactly does that mean for us domestically? What does that mean for Americans here?
Boy, you know, there are so many nuclear dimensions to this crisis now. You really have multiple nuclear nightmares unfolding, both the exercising of nuclear-capable weapons by Putin just last week before the invasion, his unprecedented nuclear threats that he gave, his false claims that he had to invade Ukraine because they were developing nuclear weapons, and now this, basically weaponizing nuclear power plants, seizing them, you know, for his war purposes. And then there's also, this could get worse. I mean, imagine if he starts losing this war and he retreats. Does he sabotage these plants on his way out? You know, this is, and then you have the issue that you raised. If Putin starts to lose this war, if he feels cornered, there is actually a Russian strategy, a military strategy called escalate to de-escalate, where the Russians would use a nuclear weapon first to prevent their defeat, to signal to the West that they're serious, this is an existential risk for them, and that they want the West to back off. Unfortunately, nuclear war games have repeatedly shown that once you start using nuclear weapons, there is no clear break. Once you use one, the adversary will use one, and that is the danger, and that is basically what's stopping us from intervening, as you were talking about with your first guest, the risk that these nuclear nightmares could just erupt into a full-fledged nuclear war. We are closer to something like this than we've been since the 1980s.
It is, Joe, what you just said there was absolutely terrifying. There's a great line in the movie Crimson Tide with Denzel Washington where he says the purpose of nuclear war ultimately serves itself. So there is no winner here. That strategy that you told us about, escalate to de-escalate, is terrifying. Thank you so much, Joe Censorione and Greg Ryatsko, for your very helpful insight. And up next, a crackdown on social media and other information outlets in Russia as Putin calls for the normalization in quotes, on international relations. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
The hot spots and pressure points on your mattress could be why you were
therapy. So you can rise from pain. Icy hot.
People who do catch COVID. David Aid with our Washington newsroom has our top story here at 6:30.
The vast majority of federal workers will once again work in person. Our schools are open. Let's keep it that way.
The message from President Joe Biden during this week's State of the Union address, showing a shift in federal government strategy to combat the 2+ years long COVID-19 pandemic.
Our kids need to be in school.
Following the speech, I asked Virginia Republican Congressman Ben Cline for his reaction. He criticized Democratic governors who shut down schools and businesses during the height of the pandemic.
They're hoping that the American people will forget what Democrats did to this economy as a result of COVID. We won't forget.
I spoke with Dr. Anthony Fauci, and he tells me the new strategy has 4 pillars: protecting against COVID, preparing for a potential new variant, preventing wide-scale economic shutdowns, and helping the rest of the world get vaccinated.
From what the critical issue is to prevent severe disease.
Fauci says vaccinations remain a first line of defense against severe illness for COVID infections.
The more we vaccinate and boost people, the better protection we have against the latter.
The new White House plan also includes making Pfizer's antiviral pill widely available. It is shown to reduce the risk of hospitalization from COVID by about 90%. The administration says it first plans to team up with pharmacies at CVS, Walgreens, and Kroger. In Washington, I'm David Aid.
President Biden also messaged another round of free at-home COVID rapid tests are coming. Starting next week, you can go to covidtest.gov to order yours. A Dakota News Now update. The former Sioux Falls police officer facing child pornography charges appeared before a federal judge today. 28-year-old Luke Schauer pleaded not guilty to charges of attempted production of child pornography and transfer of obscene materials to a minor. Schauer faces up to 30 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine. Schauer was released following his court appearance. His trial is scheduled for April 19th. Tensions appear to be boiling over after reports of Russian forces shelling a nuclear power plant. The U.S. Embassy in Kyiv called the attack a war crime. The plant is the largest in Europe and is located in the city of Enerhorder. The mayor told reporters today that the city is now under Russian control. Workers at the plant are permitted to work as normal and safety systems are functioning. Fortunately, there was no change in radiation levels. Meantime, lawmakers are speaking out after Senator Lindsey Graham suggested that someone in Russia take out Vladimir Putin. Last night, the South Carolina senator took to social media, stating that the only way this ends is for somebody in Russia to take this guy out. He continued, stating the only people who can fix this are the Russian people. We'll have much more on the crisis in Ukraine coming up later on This Week in Politics. A reminder, a local nonprofit is holding an event to support Ukraine. South Dakota Voices for Peace is inviting the community to stand in solidarity and support the Ukrainian community in Sioux Falls. An event will be held this Sunday afternoon at First Congregational Church in Central Sioux Falls. Those attending will hear stories, prayer, and strength, creating a healing space for those impacted by the Russian invasion. The discussion of a CO2 pipeline has become more frequent in the Dakota News Now viewing area in the last few months. Earlier today, we got a closer look at one in Iowa. The Summit Carbon Solutions Project is looking to connect 31 ethanol plants across 5 states. The goal is to reduce greenhouse gases emitted from the facilities. The idea is to capture carbon dioxide coming from the plants that would then be shipped via pipeline to North Dakota and stored a mile underground.
I feel very confident in the job they're going to do. They understand agriculture at Summit. They know how important our land is to us as farmers. They know to push the black topsoil off to one side, and then when they trench the trench in, they'll put the clay to the other side.
Some landowners along the pipeline's path have expressed concerns over safety and land right issues. Project organizers are planning a number of public meetings this month at communities around the region to discuss these issues. Meantime, economists say February went better than they expected. The U.S. economy added 678,000 jobs, the best month for job growth since July, and the unemployment rate edged down to 3.8%, a new pandemic-era low. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says most of the new jobs were at restaurants and bars as people look to get back to some sense of normalcy. But we still need to add 2.1 million more jobs before we hit that February 2020 level and recoup all the positions lost in the pandemic. Dakota News Now continues after this.
A community. We've become embarrassed and worried about our own democracy because of Donald Trump, because of populism, because of an ugly kind of nationalism. And I don't think we've changed in our belief, but it's diminished faith. And I would say over the last week, thanks to the heroism of the ordinary Ukrainian people, we've been inspired to be convicted about our own faith again. And I think a lot of faith has been restored. Faith in our leadership, faith in the leadership of Zelenskyy, but also Biden, German leadership, French leadership, Finnish leadership, Swedish leadership. Faith in patriotism. We've seen patriotism look like ethno-nationalism for a long time. But now we see the Ukrainian people who are patriotic about their own country, warts and all, and how it's connected to universal ideals of freedom. And then, as Jonathan said, faith in unity, that we all around the world saw a cruel bully gobbling up another nation, which used to be normal in human societies. That was just accepted. But now we've fortunately been educated by the ethos of modern democratic liberalism to be appalled. And the world is appalled, and that's true internationally. It's also true domestically. If you look at the polls, there's really not a lot of difference between Republicans and Democrats on harshness toward Putin. If anything, the Republicans want to be a little tougher on Putin. But it's not a partisan issue right now. And so morale is just super important, and it's important in Ukraine, and it's important for us. And over the long run, there'll be a lot more to say.
And on that point, Jonathan, as we listened to President Biden at the State of the Union, he did, as we said, he spoke for a number of, 12, 15 minutes about Ukraine, but then the rest of the speech was about the United States and what it's dealing with. And we heard him, as he called for, he said, we're not going to send U.S. troops into Ukraine, but we are going to be very tough in imposing sanctions on Russia. And our new poll with NPR and Marist is showing a huge percentage support, 83% support those sanctions on Russia, and 69% say they'd support it even if it means higher energy costs. So Americans prepared to have some sacrifice here.
Those poll numbers, Judy, are incredibly encouraging, because what it says to me is that the American public sees that what's happening in Russia's war on Ukraine is bigger than themselves, that in order to push back Putin, you have to put aside your own kitchen table worries, your own pocketbook issues and worries, and look at the bigger picture. And if higher gas prices is what it means, and what the sacrifice Americans have to make in order to push back an authoritarian regime like Russia, to push back on an autocrat like Putin, then that's a sacrifice they are willing to take. I'm very heartened by those poll numbers.
David, I mean, it is a recognition or an acknowledgement that the American people are taking this seriously.
Yeah, like so many countries around the world, the crowds in the European streets today were astounding. When we spoke last Friday, I thought the sanctions were kind of weak and that they wouldn't do much. And then on Saturday, Europe and the Americans dropped the big bombs of taking over the Russian central bank's assets, denying the SWIFT, and the bombs have kept falling. I mean, economic bombs. And the Russian economy is in real trouble. And so the interesting thing to me is, as this drags on, and frankly, as we see more horror, and our blood gets up, can we keep this level of unity together? Can we prevent ourselves from getting carried away and wanting to do things like a no-fly zone, which I think would be an act of war and real trouble? But can we keep up and help the Ukrainian insurgents? Can we keep up the economic pressure? The tools we have are slow, and so it'll be in a month, we'll see if these numbers are still there.
And Jonathan, you mentioned approval of President Biden. He did speak a great deal the other night at the State of the Union about his domestic agenda. And it was very interesting. Again, this poll that the NewsHour did with NPR and Marist shows that his approval rating is up 8 points. It's 47%, up from 39% just a couple of weeks ago. So there's something behind that.
Yes, there's something behind that, and that is what the American people wanted to hear from the president, in addition to showing American leadership against Putin and Russia. But what they wanted to hear, and I think they did hear it, a president who understood that, as well as the economy seems to be doing here in the United States, that they have kitchen table issues that they want the president to address. They wanted to hear that the president understood that inflation was eating away at their paychecks, whether they got wage increases or not. They wanted to hear whether he was going to do something about child care, health care, prescription drugs, all those things, those laundry list issues that the president got knocked for spending time talking about. Well, the American people wanted to know what he was going to do about it. So from the kitchen table perspective, I think voters heard what they wanted to hear, maybe not the entire solutions, but they heard that the president was serious about addressing them. And then it gets to the larger thing. Again, in this battle between democracy and autocracy, as candidate Biden said, and as President Biden has long said, democracy, in order to win against autocracy, has to show that it can work. And the way it shows it's working is by delivering for its people. And so if the president can get some headway, if Congress can pass some of the things he's talking about, including that unity agenda that he outlined in the speech, then democracy will have a chance of showing that it can work.
But this increase in approval, David, particularly interesting because there's been so much focus lately on inflation.
Yeah, we'll see if other polls carry it. I assume our poll has got something accurate to say, and that'll be confirmed by other polls. I think it's partly COVID is easing, as Jared Bernstein, the economy, at least job growth is pretty fantastic. Rally around the flag in a time of war. And I think Biden is rediscovering the language of his campaign. One of the problems he had is that independents, people sort of in the center, his approval rating among that community was about down to 30%. In the State of the Union, he spoke a lot more to that group. He emphasized we're going to refund the police. He emphasized that we're going to try to keep gas prices down. He talked about things that are not particularly ideological, but are broadly supported on mental health, on cancer, on opioid addiction. And so he's rediscovering a more centrist language. And if he wants to be reelected, he's got to win over working class voters of all races and creeds in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona and Georgia. And so focusing on those working class voters in those 5 states is the key. And I thought he did a pretty good job with that Tuesday night.
And John,
how are you even?
It's not like a school, it's a place where children, can learn something, to play music or be artist or sing or dance. So it's like that kind of place, and they took a picture, the exact name of this place. I'm not sure that they can record, translate it right to you now. And yeah, when I saw this, I didn't take picture, but I saw some costumes, like some colorful costumes for shows, or I don't know, for like dancing, and it's everything with glasses. It's awful. I really hope that no one was there at that time. I know that after this explosion, we had like 10 people died, and more than 35 had needed help. More than 35 people. So, and I'm not sure if there were children among them. It's awful.
I know that the pictures that we've seen, what you're showing, this is targeting civilians, and we can all see it now for our own eyes. Tatiana, the stores, schools, apartment buildings, cars, houses. Do you have any plans to leave yourself?
For me, I want it. I want, but like my parents, they don't want. People wanted to go somewhere where they feel safe, where they don't hear explosions, where they don't know like what will be next. Because now, I don't know, can you hear that or no? It was some explosion from just, you know, you cannot be prepared for that. And when you just sleep and you woke up just from not alarm or because you're waking up from something that made your house building, huge building, shaking, and you think, okay, the next one maybe will be in your house. You don't know that, and many people died already, and it's like you feel powerless. You cannot do anything.
Tatiana, thank you so much for talking to me. And please, you are in everyone who's watching, their thoughts and their prayers as you endure this anguish. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here, Erin. Take care.
And next, the Russian airstrikes forcing critically ill children to evacuate their hospital beds in Ukraine. And you will see them as they travel by train to get out of the country. Plus, breaking news, Italian authorities tonight seizing the Russian oligarch's yacht, $71 million yacht, yet another one seized to punish Putin.
Was overblown.
The latitude that you have on the House floor is to address the bills that are before you. And if you're trying to make a point, you know, there's limits, but that wasn't a word that's known to be a four-letter word. It's not considered foul language. I could have used a different word.
Noem went on to say in a statement released by her campaign that the Speaker of the House, Spencer Gosh, should put his personal friendship with Hauger aside and move to censure him.
Let's talk about this here for a second. So is this a limited tempest in a teapot? Is this one and done, or does this thing have legs? Are we going to hear about it next week?
You know, Brian, I think Representative Hauger got the benefit of the doubt in that this happened on a Thursday. They go into a 3-day weekend, and, you know, after the 3-day news cycle, things start to blow over a little bit. However, the governor weighing in on it definitely changes the dynamic. However, I talked to a few lawmakers in leadership positions this week. I don't think there's going to be enough momentum for a censure. I do think there's going to be a push to maybe have him apologize once again on the House floor soon.
All right, Austin, stand by. We'll come back to you here. In other news, it was a one-day candidacy for Democrat Ryan Ryder. On Wednesday, he announced he was running for Dusty Johnson's seat in Congress. On Thursday, he said his campaign was over after concerns over some tweets Ryder had posted using violent and sexist terms in talking about Johnson and Governor Noem. So far, no Democratic replacement for Ryder has been named. New economic competition for South Dakota as Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds signs a flat tax into law, 3.9% for Iowa residents, and Republican leaders say the ultimate goal is for Iowa to have no personal income tax at all. Straight ahead on This Week in Politics, South Dakota Senator John Thune says the Russian invasion of Ukraine underscores the need for energy independence in America. That's when we come back.
When Dakota News Now reports to you with the Avera
food to keep everyone fed. They live in luxury. You know, he can sit there. He can. He's probably he's in the Anchor in St. Martin right now.
All right. So if all of a sudden people are looking for Abramovich, he hops on this thing. They turn off the satellite tracking. He goes around to some shady ports around the world. You can take this thing around the world. Can you get people like boats to bring you fuel out somewhere so no one can find you?
Well, you can. These aren't that hard. They're very hard to hide. And of course, you can bring a barge out and bunker the vessel and have provisions brought out. But there are countries that are sympathetic to this, and they will allow him to come in and they'll allow him to berth. So whether he's caught in transit, they know where he is from satellites. They can tell him whether the AIS is on or not. They know where he is.
Yeah, the Well, the North Koreans do the bunkering thing all the time. We're looking at pictures inside of it. How unique is a missile defense system and bulletproof glass? You don't have that unless you think people are really out to get you.
Well, there's rumors that Putin, it's a sanctuary for Putin if it need be. And Putin could come on board. There's a submarine that'll do 50 meters dives. And it's got armor reinforcement on board the vessel.
So this is almost like a warship in a way. Half a really fancy Navy frigate or something.
Well, and it doesn't have weapons for offensive measures. It has weapons for defensive measures.
That we know.
Or so we know.
Yeah. Have you ever been around this boat? Do they sort of keep everybody away from it, or how does it work?
Well, you can go by it. I've seen the boat in St. Bart's before, especially on New Year's. They throw quite the rager. Helicopters coming and going, tenders ferrying people back and forth from St. Bart's. It's pretty impressive to see when they've got the boat lit up and 200 people on board. And I've seen parties in St. Bart's with the Rolling Stones on board. It's the most opulent thing ever. It's amazing. It really is impressive.
Yeah, it's almost the size. It's about half the size of an aircraft carrier. We put it up. An aircraft carrier is about 1,100 feet. This is a little more than 500 feet. What happens if he decides to go run on this thing, or Putin decides to go run on this thing? Is there a way to go catch up with it, or how do you seize a yacht on the high seas, even if it has defensive measures?
It's got defensive measures, but no offensive measures. And our U.S. Navy, or any Navy, France seized one. Germany's got one seized at Blumenthal shipyard right now. It isn't seized, but it's under restriction. It's set at anchor and it cannot leave. So if the military wants it, I think they know where it is. They do know where it is, and they'll seize it as soon as they get the word to seize it.
Yeah, it's absolutely remarkable to look at, and as you said, it is something unlike anything else on the ocean. Hey, Captain, it's good to see you as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. I appreciate it. Good to see you.
We appreciate the expertise. It's stunning. Up next, we'll introduce you to a product that's been #1 for 110 years, and we just showed you what it is.
Tonight, some now accusing the American and Western media of...
Here now, Wes Mitchell, former Assistant Secretary of State. So, Wes, we've heard several reports of the Russian forces raping and pillaging this poor country. Is this something the American people need to do something about, in your opinion?
Well, without question, the American people need to be aware this is happening, and I think we need to put more pressure on the Biden administration to help the Ukrainian army in its heroic effort to defend the Ukrainian homeland. And I think your previous guest said it well, that we have seen this same Russian behavior. It's basically organized barbarism on a grand scale. We've seen it in Chechnya in the 1990s, where the United Nations tells us that more than 50,000 civilians were killed. We've seen this in Syria, when the Russians came through and assisting the Syrian army, killed more than 16,000 civilians by UN estimates. So this is indeed an established Russian method of warfare. I think it's terror for the sake of terror, but I think it's also a calculated political act to put fear in the hearts of the Ukrainian people so that they won't resist.
So it's a military tactic, psychologically, that they're perpetrating these vicious crimes on the women of the country. Recall the Russian Red Army, reportedly responsible for the rape of over 1 million German women during that war, Wes.
Yes, that's right, Jesse. And of course, closer to our own time, the Russian army under Putin's command has conducted these same tactics on a vast scale. If you look at Chechnya, the atrocities that were committed against Chechen women really are too barbaric to repeat on television and don't belong in the annals of history for any civilized nation. So this is the army that Putin has created. He unleashes it against civilians to shock the population into not resisting. So it's a political act as much as part of the Russian military playbook.
And we're going to still buy their oil, apparently.
and veneers. It works on stains caused by coffee, tea, red wine, and even smoke.
Foundation. For more than 50 years, advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better.
Such important reporting so people can see this and understand the scale. Thank you. And next, our breaking news continues. The Italians now targeting, well, it appears to be the wealthiest family in Russia, seizing a major asset in Italy. We'll tell you about it.
We're so embarrassed. We overpaid for this used car. We don't even want to show our faces around here.
If you don't see me.
To leave Belfast.
What do you want?
I want you.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. We can hear you.
Very good. So I will try to proceed with my briefing on the current situation in the Ukraine, and especially after the events last night. We have been in contact with the Nuclear Regulation Agency of the Ukraine from the very beginning of the conflict, and we have been receiving updates and information from them without interruption. In general, the situation could be described as follows. The nuclear installations and the nuclear facilities in Ukraine are quite important. 4 big sites, 15 reactors and associated facilities, plus the site of Chernobyl. Regarding Chernobyl, already last week we were informed, and it was so confirmed afterwards, that the Russian special military forces took charge of the site. At the same time, the operators of the plant, of the Chernobyl plant, continued to run the day-by-day operations over there. A few days ago, we were informed again by the Russian government that military forces were moving in the area of Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with the similar mission to take over control of this facility. We got information in the sense that their advance towards the perimeter of the nuclear power plant was met with opposition and some group of civilians obstructing the access to the plant. Finally, this happened, and last night, in the early hours of the morning, we got information that a projectile had impacted a building adjacent to the block of reactors, 6 of them. The projectile impacted this building and a fire ensued, which was after some time put out by the fire brigade at the station. We confirm through our contacts at the regulator, but also directly from the plant, we were able to confirm that no security or safety systems had been compromised. Neither the reactors themselves had been hit by this projectile. Only, as I say and repeat, this building which caught fire, and perhaps you saw some images of that in the social media. After this, the operation of and at the plant have continued. We consider from a technical point of view that operation continues normally, although, as I have stressed to the border governors of the IAEA, there is no, of course, normalcy about this situation when there are military forces, of course, in charge of the site. In terms of the next steps, we continue our permanent contact with the Ukrainian authorities, governmental, nuclear regulatory, and also Energoatom, the company which operates these facilities, and also operators there. This is or constitutes the basis of the regular updates, more than 10 or 12 at this point, which you have been seeing on the website of the IAEA. At the same time, today, I indicated in the morning my readiness to travel as soon as practicable to Chernobyl in order to consult, of course, with our Ukrainian counterparts, but also, if necessary, and when necessary, to the forces in charge, in order to establish a stable framework so the observance of the basic principles of safety and security, starting with the physical integrity of the facilities, can be observed. Basic elements of this initiative proposal have already been shared with the Ukrainian counterparts and the Russian authorities, which are at this point evaluating that. We believe that having received a direct request for assistance, it is our duty as the IAEA to heed this call and to try to provide assistance. Needless to say, in particular, Madam President, to your body and the distinguished representatives over there, that this mission of the IAEA, if and when it takes place, would not, of course, have anything to do with the political and diplomatic aspects that are in the purview of the Security Council. This mission would be strictly restricted and circumscribed to the safety and security of the nuclear installations in Ukraine, which are
imagine the courage it takes to do that, to stand in front of Russian troops who have no compunction about slaughtering innocents. We've got a lot to report tonight and coverage across the region. CNN's Crystal Ward is in Kyiv. Zelenskyy, as we mentioned, is at a location not far from the nuclear plant. Across the border in Poland, where so many refugees have been arriving around the clock, hundreds of thousands. CNN's Sarah Seidner is there. And at the White House, CNN's Caitlin Collins. First, we want to give you an overview from CNN Pentagon correspondent Oren Lieberman.
The unthinkable. Now another step in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces fired on the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, seizing control of the Zaporizhzhia facility early Friday morning. Ukraine said the Russians fired on the plant from all sides, setting fire to a building near the reactor and threatening to cause a nuclear disaster.
Before this train leaves the station. Daniel Davis is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel. He's also a senior fellow at Defense Priorities. He joins us now to assess. Thank you for being with us. As I listen to these various measures, in a week's time, it's changed.
The West, who feel as though that weakness from the Western world over the last few years has put Ukraine in this position, and they fear that they're not going to get the help that they need over the coming days.
All right, Robert Sherman, thank you. The attack on that nuclear reactor sparked an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, the U.S. ambassador calling this a dangerous new escalation and calling again on Vladimir Putin to remove his troops from Ukraine. Correspondent Tom Negevin is live at the United Nations tonight. And Tom, we've seen this all play out before. The UN, is it ready this time to get tougher?
You know, nothing more than harsh language again today, Ruta. The options are limited. Russia has one of 5 veto seats on the Security Council, and its representative here calls this artificial hysteria. That's the expression he used today as the UN demands that Russian troops get away from that plant, secure it after an attack that threatened all of Europe.
By the grace of God, the world narrowly averted a nuclear catastrophe last night.
Some of the strongest condemnation coming from the U.S. and Ukraine.
It is not only Ukraine under Russian attack. It is Europe. It is the entire world. It is humanity.
Video from the plant as the attack was happening. A fire in a training area quickly extinguished. Officials inside warning of a potential catastrophe. Ukraine has 15 working nuclear reactors. They produce about half its electricity. Zaporizhzhia is the largest, not just in Ukraine, but in all of Europe. Tonight, it's occupied by Russian soldiers, as is Chernobyl, the site of the worst nuclear accident ever. Zaporizhzhia's 6 reactors are what are known as VVERs, the Russian abbreviation for water energy reactor, designed to be safe even if power to the cooling system is cut. Diesel backup generators would kick in, keeping the radioactive core from melting down.
The plant can be safe indefinitely as long as the power remains there, but that's a big if in a war zone.
And this is an unpredictable war zone. Military and energy experts simply stunned that Russia would deliberately open fire on a nuclear site.
All it takes is one missile that goes off, or like we see, some shelling that results in a fire. If the fire hadn't been contained at this power plant, it could have moved into the reactor area, and we could have seen a meltdown.
A meltdown that experts say would certainly have been worse than Chernobyl. 1 reactor there, 6 at the Zaporizhzhia site. This is very, very serious as far as the UN is concerned. Their concern, Rudabeh, is with Russian recklessness. Acts like this and what may come next if the world body allows this invasion to continue.
It's really a two-front war the Russians have opened up. From the south, they're moving in from Crimea. You mentioned that town of Kherson and the town of Mariupol. They've basically isolated those 2 cities from the rest of the country. In the north, they are shelling at least 6 towns in the northern part of the country, and that's been going on for 24 hours as well. As they do this, they are surrounding these cities. They are shutting off the power. They are taking away the water. There is no heat in these cities, so you have civilians who not only can no longer leave, but they're trapped in bunkers, and it is becoming a deteriorating and unlivable, hellish situation, according to the folks who are in these places. Now, in the capital, you have this convoy, and while it is stalled, it is still slowly making its way. 40 miles long, full of Russian tanks and armor. And look, here in the western part of the country, we continue to see that stream of refugees. The United Nations saying now more than 1.2 million people have left this country. The World Food Program is on the ground here now as well. They're looking to make a move towards Kyiv, as well as the United Nations. It just gives you an indication that the Russians are now carrying out this modus operandi, these attacks on civilian populations. It's similar to what we saw in cities like Aleppo. And as you start to see these drone footages of these cities slowly be flattened, people here are wondering if that's not what we're going to be talking about, if we're not eventually going to speak about Kyiv the way that we spoke about Aleppo, as again, it is this very crude method of war of surrounding these civilian populations and basically bombing them, Chris, into submission.
Cal Perry, really, really chilling stuff. Thank you for your reporting, and please stay safe. I'd like to bring in Julia Ioffe. She is a founding partner and Washington correspondent for Puck News. Her latest piece on the Ukrainian invasion is titled Europe's 9/11. Julia, I've been reading you religiously throughout this, and you've been talking about your interactions with friends of yours in Russia. And I wanted to start a little bit of just the shock and the reverberation of what the way that BBC Newsnight editor put it, of just the experiment of plugging your country into the global economy, the global technological matrix, basically, and then unplugging it in a matter of days, shutting it all down. What that means for Russia, what it means for Russians.
Nothing good, unfortunately. And I think the BBC correspondent is exactly right, but he may be kind of understating it. Moscow, for example, was so far ahead of cities like New York and DC and LA and London. I mean, it was one of the cities where you could pay with Apple Pay in a little bodega somewhere, you know, years before we could do that here. It was a thing, a place where everything was online. It was a very easy city to live in because of all these technological advances. And now you can't even use credit cards. My friends can't withdraw their money from ATMs. But the issue now is I don't have many friends left in Russia. They've all fled. Almost everybody has fled. A friend crossed to Estonia last night on foot in the middle of the night, in part because all the flights are sold out. There are stories going around about, you know, 5,000 euro tickets going from Moscow to Istanbul one way. There are reports coming out that the FSB is pulling people aside at the border crossings, or rather in airports, and not letting people on planes, pulling them aside for hours-long questioning, searching their electronics, asking how they feel about Putin and the war in Ukraine, which of course they don't call a war. So people are starting to drive wherever they can. It's just, I mean, he's plunging the country back into what it was under the USSR, you know, this impoverished, disconnected hermit kingdom. And it is tragic. It is obviously far less tragic than what he's doing to Ukraine, which he wants clearly dead or alive. But he's doing a lot of damage to Russia as well. And, you know, cutting people off from information. I have to say, by the way, this new law that gives people up to 15 years in prison for quote-unquote fake news about the war, fake news being anything that doesn't come directly from the Ministry of Defense. Russia is not the U.S. 15-year sentences are unheard of. That is a very, very long sentence by Russian standards. You know, people go to jail for like 5 to 8 years for murder. So this is really extreme and kind of Stalin-esque.
Yeah, I mean, that part of it, the speed with which a sort of authoritarian but kind of globalized society, right, plugged into Apple Pay, you know, a nominally independent press, which of course is constantly watching the specter of you know, the Russian security forces, but is operating in some degree of, you know, something past what it was under Stalin, like watching this hammer come down today on the press, where it's just like, no, we're not even going to pretend anymore, essentially.
That's right. And I have to say, what was left of the press until this last week was not a lot to begin with. He really cracked down on the press in the last year after Alexei Navalny came back from Germany, where he was being treated for Novichok poisoning. And when he came back and called people out into the streets, Putin said, absolutely not, and started cracking down on civil society, on NGOs, on the press. A lot of people fled then. A lot of news organizations closed up shop or really had to let go of a lot of staff. And these were the last holdouts. These were kind of the bravest of the brave. And, you know, a lot of these people that you're showing these photographs, like of that radio station, that's my friend in that photo. You know, a lot of these are my friends, and they were continuing to do this at great risk to themselves when they could have made a lot more money in the private sector. They really believed in what they were doing. They hold these values that we spread around the world, or trumpet around the world a lot more dearly than we do, because they have to fight for them every day, and now they've had to give up and leave, and that's been just soul crushing for a lot of them. They didn't want to leave their country. They wanted to make it better. And for a lot of them, it was, you know, either stay and get closed in by this new Iron Curtain or try to make a life elsewhere.
Julia Ioffe, who again has been utterly indispensable throughout this entire dark chapter. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still ahead, ahead, President Biden is facing mounting pressure from Congress to ban Russian oil. What would that mean for the U.S. next? Plus, my interview with the legendary Kareem Abdul-Jabbar on the way the sports community can influence Putin's war. All that and more coming up. Stick around.
As opposed to what it is increasingly clearly becoming on the ground, which is ratcheting up of targeting of civilian structures, a disregard for human life, as the operation does not appear to be going, according to U.S. officials, quite as quickly as successfully as President Putin had hoped. And the more they feel that pressure and that desperation, and the longer that convoy is out there without resupply, the more you are going to see, I fear, this kind of indiscriminate targeting of civilians, Anderson.
Yeah, I mean, that U.S. official we quoted at the top talking about bombing into submission as a strategy, that is what we are seeing in that apartment complex. That is what the strategy is. Sarah Seidner, at the border, what have you been seeing today? I mean, we're talking about more than 1 million people now, according to officials, have crossed over to other countries, mostly Poland, but also Romania and elsewhere, Moldova. Has the steady flow of people continued all throughout the day?
All throughout the day and into the wee hours of the morning. We are now at just past 2 a.m. here on the Poland side of the border. It is 3 a.m. just over the border in Ukraine. And we have seen all manner of things, many, again, as we've talked about so many times, women and children. We saw a family who said, look, the war had not yet, quote unquote, come to us. It hadn't arrived in our village, but the mother said there was no way she was going to put her children in harm. She had a 11-month-old, a 1-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 10-year-old, all with her bundled up, waiting here for hours for transport, and she was headed to Estonia. The company that she used to work for agreed to come and pick them up. Those are the stories where they're going and exactly where they're going to stay the night, but the one thing they want to make sure of, especially these moms and children, is that they can get out of the way of the bombing and the devastation and the shooting that is happening in and around Ukraine. Anderson.
You know, sir, later in the program, I'm going to bring you a conversation that I had earlier today for this program with Elena, the woman in a bomb shelter in Kyiv with her 3 children, who we've been talking to throughout this past week, throughout the entire invasion. People who have left, and she certainly understands their decision to leave. She knows that 1 million people leaving, it certainly is the largest of refugees in the European continent since World War II. But that there are some 43 million people who have been here. She is one of them. She's going to talk about her decision to remain with her 3 children in and not flee, and why she's made that decision. And it's important, I think, that everybody hear her perspective on that as well. So, Sarah, I appreciate the reporting. Caitlin, in the White House, we heard from President Zelenskyy today condemning NATO's decision to rule out a no-fly zone over Ukraine, saying that they gave the green light for further bombing. That was his quote at the White House, because clearly that is at this point.
No. Here, because there have been some measures where they've said, table, we're considering that, but there days later they announced they're taking that. Seems to be no budget. For U.S. officials, NATO officials are saying that this is simply not something that they believe is feasible, Anderson. That they're concerned that if NATO does try to create this no-fly zone over Ukraine, where they have to shoot down a Russian, not just the United States, but NATO into a full-fledged war. That is the concern you've heard from Secretary of State Blinken. That is the current NATO Secretary General. They're not putting boots on the ground in the sky. And the other line of thinking where Zelenskyy is, do this. If you cannot, then he said last night, at least send us planes. And he said today that if they don't establish this no-fly zone or don't help it, as they are basically because there's no way he thinks. The thing I will note, Anderson, is there are the United States sending in they could fly them in before the invasion. which can Russia, but they have made over Ukraine.
Collins, thank you. Clarissa, checking with you throughout the next 2 hours.
85 South comedy show. He's got to do some improvising. Why don't we explain it to us slowly?
Yeah. Pledge war. Ukrainian President Zelenskyy saying tonight by not.
Thank you so much. And here is the destruction in a